Good evening. Settle in. There is nothing you need to do for the next few hours except let the sound of this carry you down. Tonight we are going to sit with something most people only think about at 1 in the morning, and never on purpose. In February of 1944, a 68-year-old Swiss psychiatrist slipped on a patch of ice and broke his leg. It was an ordinary accident, the kind that happens to men of that age in that month in that country. He was taken to hospital and his leg was set and he was told to lie still. 10 days later, while lying still, a clot travelled from his leg to his lungs and his heart. His doctors did not expect him to live through it. He did live. And when he came back, he said that during those hours he had been somewhere, and that what he had seen there was so far outside the categories he had spent his life building that he could not fit it into any of them. He also said something that people find harder to hear, and that we will spend some time on tonight. He said he did not want to come back. He said he was disappointed. He was, by his own account, angry at the man who saved him. His name was Carl Gustav Jung, and this is what he described. We are going to do this carefully. Tonight is not going to tell you what happens when you die. Nobody knows. And anyone who tells you otherwise at 1 in the morning is selling something. What we are going to do is look at exactly what he reported, then look at what researchers have found in the 80 years since, including the parts that argue against him, and then sit with what is actually left when you have been honest about all of it. There is more left than you might expect, and it is a quieter thing than either side usually admits. Chapter 1. The thought that arrives at 1 in the morning. Begin with the reason you might be listening to this at all. There is a particular thought that does not visit during the day. It has no interest in daylight. It waits until the house is quiet and the tasks are finished, and there is nothing left in front of you, and then it arrives, fully formed, without an argument attached. One day, this stops. Not a fear of anything specific, not pain, not illness, not the practical arrangements, something simpler and much harder to hold. The plain fact that the person who has been in here, doing all of this noticing for however many decades, will at some point not be. During the day, this is an abstraction. You can read the sentence and feel nothing. At 1 in the morning, it stops being an abstraction, and for somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 hours, it is the only real thing in the room. Almost everybody has this. Almost nobody mentions it. It is one of the most universal experiences available to a human being, and it is treated as an eccentricity, so most people conclude they are unusual for having it, which adds a layer of loneliness to a thing that was already difficult enough. You are not unusual. You are awake at the hour when the equipment that normally keeps this at a distance has gone off duty. There is a detail about this thought that is worth noticing, because it tells you what kind of machinery is producing it. It is almost never about the future in any specific sense. It does not come with images of a funeral or a hospital or a date. Those are worries, and worries have content you can argue with. This has no content. It is closer to a sudden change of altitude. For a moment, you are looking at your own life from somewhere slightly outside it, at the whole span rather than the part you are standing on. And from that angle, the ending is visible in a way it never is from inside the day. People who study this call it mortality salience, which is a clean phrase for something that does not feel clean at all. And it has one further property that makes it worse at this hour. It resists being finished. Ordinary problems present themselves, get worked on, and are either solved or shelved. This one presents itself, and there is nothing to work on, so the mind cycles. It returns to the beginning and states the fact again and then again, with no mechanism for concluding. That is why it can occupy an hour, not because it is complicated, because it has no exit. Chapter 2. What we are actually afraid of. It is worth separating the strands because they do not all deserve the same weight, and some of them dissolve on inspection. There is a fear of dying, which is a fear of a process. Pain, indignity, being frightened, being alone, being a burden. That fear is entirely reasonable, and it is about something real, and it is largely a practical matter with practical answers, most of which involve talking to somebody while it is still early. There is a fear of what you leave unfinished, the people who depend on you, the things unsaid. That is also real, and it is also mostly practical. And then there is the third one, which is the one that actually arrives at 1 a.m, and it is not practical at all. It is the fear of not being, not of something bad happening to you, but of there being no you for anything to happen to. That third one is strange, because it is a fear of an absence, and an absence cannot hurt. Philosophers have pointed this out for well over 2,000 years, and it has never once helped anybody at 1 a.m, which should tell us something about what kind of thing it is. It is not an argument. You cannot answer it with an argument. That is why the argument never works. There is a fourth strand, less often named, and for a certain kind of person it is the heaviest of the four. It is not fear of your own ending, it is fear of the endings of other people. For most adults past a certain age, the arithmetic has already begun without permission. You have watched parents get older or watched them go. You know roughly how many more times you will see certain people. There is a number attached to your remaining ordinary Sundays with someone, and though you do not know it, you know it exists. That one is not answered by anything we will discuss tonight, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. No account of what happens after makes the gap between now and then any less real. But it belongs in the list, because when this arrives at 1 a.m, it usually arrives as a bundle, and part of the relief of separating the strands is discovering that they are 4 separate things rather than one enormous, undifferentiated dread. 3 of them have practical components, 1 does not. Knowing which one you are actually holding is a small thing, and it helps more than it should. And one thing needs saying plainly before we go any further, because of what tonight is about. There is a difference between the thought we have just described and something heavier. The thought at 1 a.m. arrives, occupies a stretch of the night, and thins out by the time the light comes. That is ordinary, and almost everyone has it, and nothing tonight is going to make it worse. If what you are carrying is not that, if it is there in the daylight too, If it has taken your appetite or your sleep across weeks rather than nights, or if any part of you has begun to think of an ending as something to arrange rather than something to fear, then that is a different thing entirely, and it is not what this recording is for. Tell somebody, tell a doctor or a person who loves you, tonight or in the morning. That is not an overreaction, and it is not a failure of stoicism. It is the correct response to a specific and treatable condition, and people are considerably better at helping than the hour makes them seem. For everyone else, we can carry on, and the carrying on is gentle from here. Chapter 3. A Patch of Ice. So, February 1944. Set the scene properly, because the ordinariness of it matters. He is 68 years old. He is at home in Switzerland in the middle of a war that his country is sitting out and surrounded by. He is one of the most well-known psychiatrists in the world, with a long marriage, 5 grown children, a practice, and a large body of published work that he considers unfinished. And he slips on ice and breaks his fibula, which is the smaller of the 2 bones in the lower leg. There is nothing symbolic about it. That is worth saying, because when a story ends somewhere extraordinary, there is a temptation to make the beginning extraordinary too, and this beginning was not. A man in his late 60s fell over in winter. He was admitted to hospital. The leg was immobilized. He was instructed to remain in bed, which was the correct treatment and which was also, as it turned out, the dangerous part. There is one further piece of context worth having, because it changes how you hear everything that follows. He was not, in 1944, a man at peace with his own mortality in the way the popular image suggests. He had spent the preceding decade in a difficult and much argued over period of his professional life, in a Europe coming apart. He was watching a war from the inside of a neutral country. He had a body of theoretical work he considered fundamentally unfinished. He had a large book on the union of opposites that he had been circling for years and could not complete. In other words, he arrived at the edge of death in the ordinary human condition, partway through, with the important thing not yet done. That matters, because when we get to his disappointment at being sent back, the natural reading is that he had achieved some serene detachment from life. He had not. He had a great deal outstanding, and he still did not want to return. That is a stranger and more interesting fact than serenity would have been. Chapter 4. 10 Days of Lying Still. Here is a thing that was much less well understood then than it is now. Lying still is not neutral. Blood that is not being moved by the ordinary contraction of leg muscles moves more slowly, and blood that moves slowly is more likely to clot. That is why anyone who has had surgery in the last 30 years is pushed to get up and walk absurdly early and given compression stockings and sometimes anticoagulants. That protocol exists because of a great many people who did what Jung did, which was to lie still with an injured leg and wait. Roughly 10 days into that stillness, a clot formed, broke away, and travelled. What happened next is described in the medical language of the time as an embolism affecting the lung and the heart, and in the plainer language of the hospital as a man in his 60s whose heart stopped being reliable and who was not expected to see the morning. He was, in the phrase used then and now, critical. It is worth pausing on how much of this story is an accident of the calendar. 10 years later, the immobilization would have been shorter and the risk better understood. 20 years later, there would have been a coronary care unit. 40 years later, the clot would very likely have been prevented outright. And if any of that had been true, there would be no vision, no account, no chapter in a famous book, and no evening like this one. The entire experience exists because of a specific gap in medical practice in a specific decade. I mention it because it is a useful corrective to the tendency to treat such events as destined. There is a version of this story, told frequently, in which the universe arranged an instruction for him. The plainer version is that a man broke his leg, was treated correctly by the standards of his time, and suffered a well-understood complication of that treatment. Both versions contain exactly the same facts. Only one of them requires anything extra. Chapter 5. What critical meant in 1944. It is worth pausing on the year because it changes the picture. There was no intensive care unit in the modern sense. Coronary care units did not exist yet and would not for about another 20 years. There was no defibrillator in routine use. There was no cardiac monitoring of the kind that would now be watching every beat and alarming at the first irregularity. There was oxygen, there was morphine, there was camphor and similar stimulants, and there was a nurse and a doctor and time, which means two things. First, that his survival was genuinely uncertain in a way that is difficult to appreciate now. Second, and more relevant for tonight, that nobody was measuring anything. There is no trace of what his heart was doing, no record of his oxygen levels, no timeline of minutes. That absence matters. When we get to the research later, one of the things you will notice is how much of the modern argument turns on measurements nobody was taking in 1944. We have his account and the account of those around him, and nothing else. That is not a reason to dismiss it. It is a reason to hold it as testimony rather than as data. There is a second consequence of the year that is easy to miss and worth stating. Because there was no measurement, there is also no way to know how close he actually came. That sounds like a technicality. It is not. It is the single largest uncertainty in the entire account. In the modern research we will come to, the whole apparatus depends on knowing exactly what happened to the body. Whether the heart stopped, for how long, what the blood gases were, what drugs were given, and when. That is the spine of the field. For Jung, we have none of it. We have a diagnosis given in the language of 1944, a doctor's expectation that he would not survive, and a patient's later recollection. He may have been minutes from death. He may have been extremely ill and frightened, and not quite as close as everyone believed. Both are consistent with what survives. That does not make the experience less real as an experience. But it does mean that this account cannot be used as evidence about what happens at the actual edge, because we do not know that he was at it. Chapter 6. What the nurse said. There is one external detail that survives, and it is the sort of detail that is impossible to verify and difficult to ignore. His nurse told him afterwards that during the worst of it, she had the impression he was surrounded by a bright glow. She said she had seen this before in patients who were close to death and that she recognized it. Consider what to do with that. It is a single report from one person given to a patient afterwards in a hospital about a phenomenon with no physical measurement attached. It is exactly the kind of testimony that cannot be checked, and it comes from a period and a setting in which such things were spoken about more freely than they are now. I am including it because he included it, and because leaving it out to make the story tidier would be its own kind of dishonesty. But it should be filed where it belongs, which is under things a person said, not under things that were established. That distinction is going to do a lot of work tonight, and it is worth getting used to the feel of it early. There is a general point buried in that small story, and it is one of the more useful habits of mind available. When you meet a claim like the nurse's, there are 3 drawers, not 2. The first drawer is true, the second is false. And most people, in most conversations, try to sort everything into one or the other, which is why arguments about this material become so unpleasant so quickly. The third drawer is the one that gets used least and needs to be used most. It is labelled, "This is a report, and I cannot check it, and it may be entirely sincere, and it stays here." Almost everything in tonight's story belongs in the third drawer, not the research material we will come to later, which belongs in the first 2 and can be argued about properly. But the account itself is third drawer material from beginning to end. You lose nothing by putting it there. A thing in the third drawer can still be beautiful, still be worth thinking about, still change how you feel at 1 in the morning. It simply cannot be used to win an argument, and it should not be. Chapter 7. The Edge. Now to what he reported. The first thing worth saying is that he did not describe a blur. People often assume that the experiences of a dying brain must be vague and dreamlike, the way ordinary dreams are vague, and that what such a person brings back would be impressionistic at best. His account is the opposite of vague. It is specific, ordered, and visually precise, and he insisted for the rest of his life that it was more real than ordinary waking, not less. He used the word real deliberately and repeatedly, and he was a man who had spent 40 years listening to patients describe inner states and had developed an unusually fine vocabulary for distinguishing between kinds of them. That does not make him right. A vivid experience is not a true one, and he knew that better than most. But it does rule out the easiest dismissal. Whatever this was, it was not a man vaguely remembering a fever dream. It was a clinician reporting, in detail, an experience he found more coherent than the room he woke up in. He made one further claim about the quality of it that is worth taking seriously because of who was making it. He said the experiences were not products of imagination and that there was nothing subjective about them. Now, that is a very large claim, and taken at face value, it is not one he could possibly be entitled to. No one can verify from the inside that their own experience is not being generated from the inside. That is precisely the thing you cannot check from where you are standing. But consider what he was doing professionally when he said it. He had spent 40 years listening to people describe internal states and had built a substantial part of his reputation on distinguishing between them. He had categories for fantasy, for dream, for delirium, for hallucination in psychosis, for the ordinary daydream, for the deliberately imagined image. He worked with these distinctions every day. So when he says this did not belong to any of those categories, he is not making a metaphysical claim. He is making a clinical one in his own area of expertise about how an experience presented to a trained observer, he could still be wrong. Experts misclassify their own experience all the time, and being close to death is not a good condition for careful observation. But it is a report from someone with an unusually well-developed vocabulary for exactly this, and that is worth something. Chapter 8. Very high up. He said he was very high above the earth. He gave a figure, which he had worked out afterwards rather than known at the time, of something on the order of 1,000 miles, and he described what he could see from there. Far below him, bathed in a glorious blue light, was the globe of the earth. He could see the deep blue of the sea and the outlines of the continents. Beneath his feet, he said, was Ceylon, which is the island we now call Sri Lanka. Ahead of him was the subcontinent of India. His field of vision did not take in the whole planet, but its form was plainly distinguishable, and the outlines of it shone with a silvery gleam through the blue. In some places, he said, the earth looked coloured, or spotted dark green, like oxidized silver. Away to the left, in the distance, lay a broad expanse, the reddish-yellow desert of Arabia, as though the silver of the earth had taken on a reddish gold there. Then came the Red Sea, and far away, at the very edge, he could just make out a fragment of the Mediterranean. It is worth noticing the direction of his attention in this part of the account, because it is unusual. He was, on his own telling, dying, and he was looking at geography. There is no fear in it, no panic, no sense of a body being left behind in distress, no backward glance at the hospital or the war or the family. He describes the Arabian desert like a man leaning out of a window. Compare that to what the modern reports typically contain at the equivalent moment, and it matches closely. The consistent finding across the research literature is that these experiences are overwhelmingly reported as peaceful. Distressing versions exist and are documented, and they are a real minority phenomenon that deserves more attention than it gets. But they are the exception. Whatever the mechanism, the ordinary output is calm. That is a strange fact about a body in crisis, and it is one of the things that makes the purely physiological accounts feel incomplete to people who work with these patients. Even when those accounts are correct as far as they go, a system failing catastrophically might reasonably be expected to produce terror. It usually produces the opposite. Chapter 9. The detail that people always raise. At this point, somebody usually says, "But nobody had seen the Earth from space in 1944. That is true, and it is worth handling properly rather than either leaning on it or ducking it. The first photograph of the Earth from space was taken in 1946 by a camera on a captured V-2 rocket launched from New Mexico 2 years after this. The famous color images that fixed the picture in everyone's mind, the ones from the Apollo missions, were more than 20 years away. So he was describing a view that no human being had ever had. But he was not describing a view that no human being could have constructed. He was an educated man in the age of the Atlas. He had traveled, notably to India in 1938, and he had flown. Anyone who has looked at a globe knows what the Earth looks like from far enough away, in the sense of shape and the arrangement of land and sea, and knows that the oceans are blue and the deserts are reddish. The genuinely surprising features of the real view, the thinness of the atmosphere, the specific way cloud dominates the picture, the fact that the land is largely obscured, are not what he described. So, this is not evidence of anything paranormal, and treating it as such is a mistake that gets made a great deal on the internet. It is, however, a striking image for a man to assemble while his heart was failing, and it is the beginning rather than the substance of what he reported. While we are being careful, there is a second detail here worth handling with the same honesty. He gave the figure of 1,000 miles. He also said, in the same passage, that he worked that out afterwards. He did not perceive an altitude. He later reasoned that the extent of what he could see implied roughly that height. This is a small thing, and it is the sort of small thing that gets lost in retelling, where it becomes, he correctly identified his altitude at 1,000 miles. He did not. He estimated it in a hospital bed after the fact from what he remembered seeing. I keep drawing attention to these because the story does not need the embellishments and is damaged by them. Every time one of these accounts is inflated by someone trying to make it more convincing, it becomes easier for a reasonable person to dismiss the entire thing. The unembellished version is quite strong enough. A man in cardiac crisis reported a coherent, ordered, visually specific experience of great personal significance. And it changed the last 17 years of his life. Nothing needs to be added to that. Chapter 10. What he had to leave behind. Then, in his account, something detached. He described the sense that everything was being taken away from him, everything he aimed at or wished for or thought, everything that had been the phenomenal world. And he said this was not a violent stripping but something more like a sloughing off, and that it was extremely painful. And then, when it had finished, something remained. He said it was as if he now carried along with him everything he had ever experienced or done, everything that had happened around him. He had it all with him, and he was it. He consisted of his own history, and he felt with great certainty that this was what he was. Here is the sentence he used, and it is worth hearing exactly. I consist of my own history, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am. Notice what is being described, because it is not what most accounts of dying describe. Not a dissolving into light, not a merging into everything, the opposite. A stripping away of everything that was not you until what is left is precisely and only the shape of the life you actually lived. Whatever else that is, it is a strange thing for a man's mind to produce, and it is a great deal more austere than what people usually hope for. Stay with the stripping for a moment longer, because it is the part of the account with the most obvious bearing on anyone listening. He described losing in order what he had aimed at, what he had wished for, what he had thought, the whole phantasmagoria of earthly existence. Read that list slowly and notice that it is almost entirely made of the future. Aims are future, wishes are future. Even most thinking, if you watch it honestly for 10 minutes, turns out to be rehearsal or review, which are the future and the past wearing each other's clothes. Strip all of that away, and what he says remains is the completed thing. Not what he was going to do, what had actually occurred. There is an ordinary version of this available at 1 a.m, and it costs nothing to try. Set down, briefly, everything that is aim, or wish, or plan. Not permanently, and not as a philosophy. Just for the next few minutes, since none of it is actionable at this hour anyway. What is left is a life that has already happened, most of it, and it is not nothing, and it does not require your supervision tonight. Chapter 11. The Black Stone. Not far from him, in space, there was a block of stone. He described it as dark, roughly the size of a house, and floating as he was floating. He said it looked like a meteorite. It was not the only thing there, but it was the thing his attention went to, and he recognized the kind of object it was. He had seen stones like it on the coast of the Bay of Bengal on his travels. Enormous dark blocks of rock that had been hollowed out and made into temples. This is a useful detail for understanding what kind of experience this was. He was not seeing something with no relationship to his own memory. He was seeing something built out of materials he had actually handled. The temples of the Indian coast, the rock-cut sanctuaries, the specific darkness of that stone. It came from his life. That is not a debunking. It would be true of any experience anyone has ever had, including this ordinary one you are having right now, in which every element of the room is being assembled out of things you already know. But it is worth noticing, because a great deal of the argument we will come to later turns on whether an experience made of your own materials can nonetheless be a report about something other than yourself. There is a question worth asking about that stone, and it has no answer. But the asking is useful. Why a temple? If a mind under extreme stress is going to assemble an image of a destination, there are a great many available. A house, a garden, a road, a lit window. The reports collected since the 1970s contain all of these and more, and the furniture is famously culture-bound. People tend to meet the figures their upbringing supplied and arrive at the architecture they were raised with. His mind produced a rock-cut sanctuary from the Indian coast. That is not the architecture of a Swiss Protestant childhood. It is the architecture of a man who had spent 30 years reading comparative religion and had traveled to see the originals, and whose entire professional argument was that the deepest layers of the mind speak in images that are older and stranger than the ones we are handed locally. So the vision is, at minimum, extraordinarily consistent with his own theory. That cuts both ways, and it is worth saying so plainly. It is either a striking confirmation, or it is precisely what you would expect a mind to produce, when it has spent decades rehearsing that vocabulary. Both readings survive the evidence. Only one of them requires anything new. Chapter 12. The man in the lotus posture. There was an entrance in the side of the stone, leading into a small antechamber. To the right of the entrance, a dark-skinned Hindu sat silently in lotus posture upon a stone bench. He wore a white gown. Jung said he knew, without being told, that the man was expecting him. And then a phrase that is worth repeating slowly, because it is the most precise thing in the entire account. The man was expecting him without expectation. Sit with that, not waiting anxiously, not indifferent either. Present, ready, entirely without the forward lean that characterizes almost every moment of ordinary human waiting. If you have ever met a person like that, and most people meet 2 or 3 in a lifetime, you know it is unmistakable and almost impossible to describe, and he has described it in 3 words. 2 steps led up into the antechamber. Inside, on the left, was the gate to the temple proper. There is something else in that phrase worth sitting with, because it describes a state most people have never been in and immediately recognize. Expecting without expectation. Almost every form of waiting we know is contaminated. We wait for something with a preference attached, and the preference produces tension, and the tension is what makes waiting unpleasant. Waiting rooms are unpleasant for exactly this reason, and not because of the chairs. What he is describing is a figure that is entirely ready and entirely unhurried, with nothing riding on the outcome, and yet not indifferent, because the readiness is specifically for him. You occasionally meet this in a person, sometimes in someone very old, sometimes, oddly, in people who work at the edges of medicine, in hospices or in emergency rooms, who have developed a way of being completely present to a situation without leaning on it. If the image is worth taking away from tonight, it might be that one rather than any of the grander ones, not the temple, the posture, ready and not pulling. Chapter 13. The lamps. Around that gate there were niches, innumerable small hollows in the rock, and in each one a saucer-shaped concavity filled with coconut oil, and in each a small burning wick. He said the door was surrounded by a wreath of bright flames. I want to stay with this image for a moment, because if you take nothing else visual from tonight, this is the one worth keeping when you turn the light off. A dark rock in a dark space, a doorway, and around the doorway hundreds of small flames in oil, none of them large, each one steady. Not a blaze, not a searchlight. Hundreds of small, quiet lights defining the shape of a way in. Whatever you conclude about where this came from, that is an extraordinarily beautiful thing for a mind to produce, while the body it belongs to is failing. And it is worth noting how unfrightening it is. There is no threat anywhere in this account. There never is in his telling. Whatever the dying brain was doing that night, it was not producing horror. It is worth staying with the physical scale of that image, because it is the opposite of what people expect. Nothing in it is large. The stone is the size of a house, which is big for a rock and small for a revelation. The antechamber is small, the steps number 2. And the lights are not a radiance or a blaze. They are individual small wicks floating in oil in individual small hollows. The kind of lamp that has been lit by hand in that part of the world for several thousand years. Almost every popular account of dying reaches immediately for the enormous, infinite light. Boundless love, vast presence. He describes something you could walk around in a minute. I find that persuasive in a way I cannot fully justify, and I want to flag that as a feeling rather than an argument. But the specificity of small things is generally a marker of description rather than invention. When people invent, they inflate. When people describe, they notice that there were 2 steps. Chapter 14. What he expected to find inside. He said he had once been in this temple before, though he could not say when or how, and he was certain about what was on the other side of the door. He knew that he was about to enter an illuminated room, and that he would meet there all those people to whom he belonged in reality. Not the people he happened to know, the people he belonged to. And he knew that there he would at last understand something. He put it this way: he would understand what historical nexus he or his life fitted into. He would know what had been before him, why he had come into being, and where his life was flowing. Read that as a description of a want rather than as a report of a place, and notice how enormous it is and how few people ever say it out loud. Not, "I want to live longer," not, "I want to see my family again," something else entirely. "I want to know what the whole thing was for. I want to see the shape of it from outside. I want somebody to show me where my particular 68 years sat in the pattern and why." That is a wish almost everybody has and almost nobody articulates, and it is the actual content of the one in the morning thought we started with. The fear is not only that it ends, the fear is that it ends without ever being explained. It is worth noticing how thoroughly this differs from what a frightened man might be expected to want. A person in terror wants rescue. A person in pain wants relief. A person facing an ending on the ordinary account wants more time. He wanted an explanation. And not an explanation of the universe in general, which is what philosophers are supposed to want, something much more particular and much more human. He wanted to know where his own specific life fitted, what had come before it that made it necessary, and where it was going. That is a want with a very distinctive shape. It is the want of someone who suspects their life has been part of something and has never been shown the pattern. I suspect it is nearly universal and nearly unspoken. People will admit to wanting more years. Very few will admit to wanting more than the years, to be told what the years were for. Chapter 15. The sloughing off. As he approached the steps, the thing described earlier happened. Everything fell away. He said it was as though everything he had aimed at, wished for, thought, the whole phantasmagoria of earthly existence fell away or was stripped from him. It was, he said, an extremely painful process. And then, when it was done, he still was. What remained was not nothing. What remained was the sum of what he had actually lived. Now, hold that beside the previous chapter and notice that the two fit together with an uncomfortable neatness. He expects to walk through a door and be told the meaning of his life. And immediately before the door, everything is removed except the life itself, which reads less like an arrival and more like a preparation, as though the only thing you are permitted to bring to that room is the record, and the record is not the version you tell people, or the version you meant, or the version you were still intending to complete. It is what actually happened. There is a version of this idea in almost every tradition that has ever thought about the subject, and it is usually dressed up in scales and books and judgment. What is striking about his telling is that there is no judge in it. Nobody weighs anything. There is simply the removal of everything that was not the life, and then the plain fact of the life, and he reports that as certainty rather than as verdict. This is what I am. There is an aspect of that sequence worth drawing out, because it inverts the usual order. In most accounts of judgment, the life is reviewed in order to determine what happens next. The life is evidence, and something else is the verdict. Here there is no next. The stripping does not produce a case to be heard. It produces an identity. The life is not evidence about him. The life is him. If you take that seriously for a moment, it changes what a day is. Under the ordinary view, most days are instrumental. They are spent getting to something, and their value is in what they produce. A day that produces nothing was wasted. Under the view in this vision, there is no separate thing being produced. The days are the material. An ordinary Tuesday in which nothing happened is not a failed investment, it is a piece of the only object there is. That is either a profound reframing or an elaborate consolation, and at 1 a.m, the difference between those two is smaller than it looks in daylight. Chapter 16. The image that came up from below. He never reached the door. Something came up from below, from the direction of Europe. It rose into his field of vision, and it was an image of his doctor. Or rather, and this is the way he put it was his doctor in his primal form, framed, he said, by a golden chain or a golden laurel wreath. And Jung understood immediately what it meant. He thought, this is my doctor, the one who has been treating me. But now he is coming in his primal form, as a basileus of Kos. In life, he was an avatar of that figure, the temporal embodiment of the primal form which had existed from the beginning. Now he is appearing in that primal form. The message was not spoken as an argument, it was simply delivered and simply understood. There was a protest against his going away. He had no right to leave the earth. He must return. And the moment he heard that, the vision stopped. Notice the direction it came from. Up, from below, from Europe. That is a small detail, and it is doing a great deal of work. Everything in the vision to this point has been oriented outward and upward, away. The earth is below and behind him, receding. He is moving toward a door. And the thing that stops him arrives from the direction he came from, carrying, in his own words, a protest from the earth. Whatever else this is, it is a remarkably well-constructed piece of narrative. The obstacle enters from the correct direction, wearing the correct authority at the correct moment, and it does not argue. It simply outranks him. Dreams do this occasionally. Most dreams do not. Most dreams are structurally incoherent in ways we forgive on waking because we are used to them. This one has an architecture, and the architecture is one of the reasons he insisted for the rest of his life that it was not a dream. Chapter 17. The Basileus of Kos. The phrase deserves unpacking because it is not decoration, and it tells you something about the mind that produced it. Kos is a Greek island in the Aegean. It is the traditional birthplace of Hippocrates, and it was the site of a great Asclepion, a healing sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, where the sick came to sleep in the precinct in the hope of a curative dream. For a very long stretch of the ancient world, Kos was where medicine and the sacred were the same activity. Basileus means king. So the figure that arrives to send him back is not simply his physician, it is the king of the island where healing began. It is the archetype of the doctor arriving in person to exercise authority. You do not have to accept any metaphysical claim to find that remarkable as a piece of construction. Under the most deflationary reading available, a failing brain, starved and disordered, reached into a lifetime of classical learning and produced exactly the right symbol, correctly specified, with the correct authority to overrule him at the exact moment it was needed. That is not evidence of an afterlife. It is evidence that the thing we call a dying mind is doing something considerably more organized than dying. It is worth pausing on the fact that the figure who sends him back is a physician, not a god, not an ancestor, not a figure of judgment. A doctor arriving in the form of the oldest doctor there is, carrying the authority of the profession itself to say that this patient is not finished and must return. Whatever produced that image had a very precise sense of who was entitled to overrule him. Jung was a physician. He had spent his working life inside the medical relationship on the other side of it. The one authority a doctor cannot easily refuse is another doctor, and there is something quietly moving in the choice which I do not think is overreading. The message is not that he has failed some test, or that he is unworthy, or that his time is not up in some cosmic ledger. The message is that there was a protest. Somebody on the earth wanted him back, and the person who came to say so was the man who had been sitting up with him. Chapter 18. Sent back. We should be honest about how he took it, because this is the part that gets edited out of almost every retelling. He did not come back grateful. He was, in his own word, profoundly disappointed. Everything seemed pointless. He had been on the verge of the answer, and the answer had been withdrawn, and he had been returned to the room, the bed, the leg, the war, the correspondence. He was, he said, violently resistant to his doctor for having brought him back to life. He also formed a conviction he found extremely uncomfortable, which was that his doctor's own life was now in danger. He had appeared in his primal form. In Jung's reading of his own vision, when someone attains that form, it means they are about to die. He tried obliquely, to warn him. He could not say it plainly, and the doctor did not take it up. It is worth asking why the disappointment matters so much, because it is the detail I would keep if I could keep only one. It functions as a kind of internal check on the account. If a person invents a story like this, consciously or not, the invention tends to serve them. It flatters, or it comforts, or it makes them the recipient of something special. The overwhelming majority of embellished accounts have that shape, which is why the shape is a warning sign. This one does not flatter him. It makes him petulant. He is offered his life back, at 68, with unfinished work and a family and years ahead of him, and his reaction is resentment toward the man who arranged it. That is not a good look, and he knew it, and he recorded it anyway. And testimony that damages the person giving it is generally worth more than testimony that helps them. It is not proof of anything. But of all the reasons to take his account seriously as a sincere report, this is the strongest one available. Chapter 19. What happened to Dr. H? Here is the part of the story that is genuinely difficult to hold, and I'm going to give it to you exactly as he gave it, and then be clear about its status. On the 4th of April, 1944, Jung was allowed to sit up on the edge of his bed for the first time. He remembered the date for that reason. On that same day, his doctor took to his own bed and did not leave it again. He died not long after of septicemia. Jung wrote flatly, "I was the last patient he treated." Now, what do we do with that? The honest answer is that we do not do very much with it. It is a coincidence of a kind that feels enormous from inside a life and is statistically unremarkable from outside one. Doctors in 1944 died of septicemia with some regularity, in the years just before antibiotics became widely available. Elderly patients form fears about their physicians. Dates get remembered and aligned afterwards in ways that tighten the story. And the account was written down more than a decade later by a man with a deep investment in the meaningfulness of coincidence. None of which makes it false. It makes it unverifiable, which is a different thing, and we are going to keep those two apart all night. I include it because he included it, and because the version of this story that quietly drops the inconvenient part is not the version worth listening to. There is one more angle on this that is worth having, and it belongs to the study of memory rather than the study of dying. Accounts like this are always retrospective. There is no way to interview someone during the event. So everything we have from Jung and from every research subject is a memory of an experience produced afterwards in language, usually more than once. And memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction, and every retelling reshapes it slightly, and the reshaping tends toward coherence. The story gets tidier, the sequence firms up, the meanings sharpen. There is a specific finding here worth knowing. When researchers compared memories of near-death experiences with memories of real events and with memories of imagined ones, the near-death memories scored higher on measures of detail and clarity than memories of actual events did. That is a genuinely odd result, and both camps claim it. One reading is that the experience was more vivid than reality, as those who have them insist. The other is that these memories have been rehearsed and elaborated more than ordinary ones, which is exactly what would produce that signature. Jung told this story in some form over roughly 17 years before it was recorded. That is a great deal of rehearsal. Chapter 20. The box. The last piece before we leave the hospital. He described the world he came back to in a way that is worth hearing, because it is the exact inverse of how these stories usually go. He did not return radiant. He returned claustrophobic. He described existence as a kind of box system, a segment of being cut out and set up in 3 dimensions especially for the purpose, and he found it unbearably small. He had, for a few hours, been somewhere with a different number of dimensions, and coming back into this one felt like being folded up and put away. Roughly 3 weeks of depression followed, and then, at night, the visions came back. He would wake around midnight and lie awake for an hour or so in what he described as an indescribable state of ecstasy, and the things he saw during those nights, he later said, were the most tremendous things he had ever experienced. He said it was impossible to convey the beauty and the intensity of the emotion in them. They stopped after a few weeks and never returned. We will come back to that detail much later, because it turns out to be one of the more interesting facts in this whole account, and it is one that almost nobody notices. There is a phrase in that passage that deserves attention from anyone who has been unwell for a long stretch. He found ordinary existence unbearably small afterwards. That is a documented pattern, and it is one of the harder parts of this material. People who have these experiences frequently return with a period of real difficulty, and the difficulty is not what anyone expects. It is not trauma from having nearly died. It is grief at having come back. The research literature discusses this under the heading of reintegration problems, and it can include depression, a sense of alienation from family, difficulty caring about ordinary concerns, and in some cases, the breakdown of relationships with people who cannot understand why the person is not simply relieved. Jung had 3 weeks of it. Many people have considerably longer. I mention it because the popular version of these accounts is uniformly uplifting, and the reality includes a stretch that is quite hard, and anyone who has actually been through something like this deserves to hear that their difficulty afterwards is common and documented rather than a failure of gratitude. Chapter 21. Why he said nothing for years. He was one of the most prolific writers in his field. He published constantly. He corresponded with thousands of people. He had a platform and an audience and every opportunity to describe what had happened to him. He said almost nothing about it publicly for the rest of his working life. The account we have was not written for publication in the ordinary sense. It came out at the very end, when he was in his 80s, in a set of recorded conversations, and it did not appear in print until after he was dead. His stated reason for the silence is worth taking seriously, and it is the reason a serious person would give. He said such things could only be described in a way that risked being misunderstood, and that they were not the sort of material that survives contact with the wrong kind of attention. There is a less flattering reading available, which is that a man who had spent decades fighting to be regarded as a scientist had every professional incentive to keep quiet about floating above Ceylon. That reading is probably also true. The two are not in competition. Either way, notice the shape of the decision. He had the most extraordinary experience of his life, and he did not monetize it, did not build a doctrine on it, and did not tell the public about it for 17 years. It is worth being concrete about what the professional risk actually was. He had spent his whole career fighting a specific accusation that he had abandoned science for mysticism. It was made by colleagues, by reviewers, and by the psychoanalytic movement he had broken from. It followed him for 50 years, and it follows him still. Now imagine him publishing, in 1946, at the height of the argument, a first-person account of floating 1,000 miles above Ceylon and being turned back from a temple door by the king of Kos. There is no version of that which does not end the argument permanently in his opponent's favor. So the silence is not mysterious. It is what any person in his position would have done, and the fact that it also matches his stated reason about being misunderstood does not make the stated reason false. People usually have more than one reason, and the reasons usually agree with their interests. What is notable is not that he waited. It is that he told it at all at the very end, when it could still damage the reputation he would leave behind, and when he could very easily have taken it with him. Chapter 22. What kind of book this comes from? The account survives in a book called Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And before we lean on it any further, we should be straight about what that book is, because it is not quite what its cover suggests. It is usually described as Jung's autobiography. It is more accurately a collaboration. From 1957 onwards, an associate named Aniela Jaffe recorded conversations with him and worked them into prose. Jung wrote some sections himself and revised others, and left some alone. Scholars who have gone back to the original materials, most notably Sonu Shamdasani, have shown that the book was edited more heavily than its presentation implies. Material was cut. Some was removed at the request of the family. The voice was smoothed. The result is a genuine record of what he said, shaped by other hands, presented as a seamless first-person memoir when it was nothing of the kind. This does not mean the account is fabricated. There is no serious suggestion of that. But it does mean that when I quote a phrase tonight, the correct mental footnote is, "This is what appears in a book assembled from recorded conversations with an 82-year-old man about something that happened to him at 68, edited by an associate and published after his death." That is still testimony worth having. It is just not a laboratory notebook, and anybody who presents it as one is not being careful with you. It is worth being fair to the book as well as skeptical of it, because skepticism that only runs one direction is not skepticism. The core account has never been seriously challenged as a fabrication. The editorial concerns are about shaping, omission, and voice. What was left out, whose sentences these finally are, how much smoothing occurred. They are real, and they matter for how much weight any particular phrase can carry. They are not allegations that the events were invented. Nobody who has examined the underlying materials has suggested that Jung did not have a serious cardiac crisis in 1944, or that he did not report visions during and after it, or that he did not describe them in essentially the terms that reached print. So the correct posture is neither to quote the book as though it were a transcript, nor to discard it as unreliable. It is to treat the substance as well attested and the exact wording as approximate. That is, incidentally, how historians treat almost every source they have, and it is a much less exciting posture than either certainty or dismissal. Chapter 23. The sentence. With all of that in place, here is the line from it that has travelled furthest. He wrote that what happens after death is so unspeakably glorious that our imagination and our feelings do not suffice to form even an approximate conception of it. It is a very beautiful sentence, and it gets quoted constantly, usually stripped of everything around it, usually with the implication that Carl Jung, the great psychologist, confirmed the afterlife. He did not confirm anything, and we will get to what he actually claimed shortly. But before we complicate it, let it sit for a second as what it is, which is a report of the emotional quality of the experience rather than a proposition about the universe. He is not saying, I have established that there is a glorious afterlife. He is saying, what I encountered had a quality so far past my equipment that my imagination cannot reach back to it. Those are different sentences. The second one is much harder to argue with and much easier to believe, and considerably more interesting. There is a smaller sentence from the same passage that I think is better than the famous one, and it almost never gets quoted. He said that the experiences were the most tremendous things he had ever experienced, and that it was impossible to convey their beauty and intensity. Notice the structure of that. It is a report of failure. The famous sentence sounds like a description of the afterlife. This one is a man saying, I have spent 60 years developing a technical vocabulary for inner experience. I am unusually good at this, and I cannot get it across. That is a much more credible thing for a person to say, and much less useful for anyone wanting a quotation to put over a photograph of a sunset. It also happens to be the single most consistent feature in the entire modern research literature. Across thousands of collected accounts in many languages, the most reliable thing people say is that it cannot be said. Ineffability is oddly the most reproducible finding in the field. Chapter 24. The 10 years. Now, the part of this story that is checkable and which almost nobody mentions, and which I think is the strongest thing in the whole account. Look at what he did afterwards. He was 68 and had nearly died. The reasonable expectation for a man in that position in 1944 is a quiet decline, some light correspondence, perhaps a final collection. Instead, the decade that follows is the most productive of his entire life. He said so himself, plainly. After the illness, a fruitful period of work began, and a good many of his principal works were written only then. That is not false modesty in reverse, it is simply accurate. The major late works, the ones specialists still argue about, all come after 1944. The long study of the self and its symbols. The book on synchronicity. the enormous final work on the union of opposites that he had been circling for decades and had never been able to finish. And the strange, furious little book on the Book of Job that he wrote at speed while ill again, and which remains the most controversial thing he ever published. He gave a reason for the change, and it is a specific one. He said the insight he had, the vision of the end of all things, gave him the courage to undertake new formulations. It is worth spelling out why this matters more than anything else in the account, because it is easy to hear it as a footnote. Everything else tonight is testimony. This part is behavior. Testimony can be sincere and still be wrong. A man can honestly report an experience that was entirely generated by a failing brain, and his sincerity tells us nothing about the world beyond his skull. Behavior is different. Behavior leaves a record that does not depend on the person's interpretation of it. The books exist. The dates on them are checkable. The change in tone between the work of the 1930s and the work of the late 40s and 50s is available to anyone willing to read both, and it is not subtle. So we have, independent of anything he claimed, a documented change in a man's productive output and his willingness to take risks, beginning immediately after this event and lasting until his death. That does not tell us what the experience was. It tells us that it was not trivial, and that whatever category it belongs in, that category includes things that reorganize a person. Chapter 25. Courage is the word to notice. Not knowledge, not revelation, courage. Think about what that implies, because it is an unusually modest claim for a man describing a mystical experience. He is not saying the vision told him what to write. He is saying it removed something that had been stopping him. What had been stopping him, on his own account elsewhere, was fear of how the work would be received. He had spent his career being told he had drifted out of science and into mysticism, and he had spent a great deal of energy managing that accusation, hedging, framing, defending his flank. After 1944, he mostly stopped bothering. The late books are stranger, bolder, and much less concerned with respectability than the early ones. The book on Job in particular reads like a man who has decided he no longer has time to be careful about his reputation. Whatever happened in that hospital, its measurable effect on the historical record is that a cautious man stopped being cautious for the last 17 years of his life and did his most original work in that period. There is a way of testing that claim, and it does not require trusting him. Read the endings of his books. The work from the middle period is full of protective apparatus. Qualifications, restatements of method, careful reminders that he is speaking as an empiricist about psychic phenomena and making no claim about metaphysical reality. Those passages are doing a job, and the job is defensive. The late work still contains qualifications because he never entirely stopped being a careful man, but the proportion changes sharply. He begins to write as though the reader who was going to object has already objected and it did not matter. The book on Job is the clearest case. It is a furious, personal, theologically outrageous piece of writing in which a psychologist puts God on the couch, and he published it knowing exactly what it would cost him. It cost him a good deal. Friends were dismayed. Reviews were savage in places. He was 76. Whatever you make of the vision, this is the part of the story that would show up in a biography written by someone who did not believe a word of it. A cautious man stopped being cautious, late, and the change is dated. Chapter 26. What he actually claimed. So let us be exact about his position, because it is routinely misrepresented in both directions. He did not claim to have proved survival after death. He was explicit and repeated about this. He held that we have no way to establish it, that the question lies outside what any science can reach, and that anyone claiming certainty in either direction is overreaching. What he claimed was narrower and stranger. He claimed that the psyche produces images of continuation spontaneously in people who are not expecting them and have no doctrinal commitment to them. He claimed that in his clinical experience, the unconscious behaves as though the question of an ending is not settled, and that this behavior is observable whatever its cause. And then he made the move that is characteristic of him, and which is either the most honest thing in his whole body of work or the most slippery, depending on your temperament. He declined to say whether that pattern is a fact about reality or a fact about the mind. He said he could not determine it, and that the honest position was to say so. There is a distinction underneath his position that is worth extracting, because it is genuinely useful outside this subject. He is separating two questions that almost everyone runs together. The first is, does something continue after death? That is a question about the world, and he says, correctly, that we have no method for answering it. The second is, what does the mind do with the fact of death? That is a question about people, and it is answerable by observation in the ordinary way. His entire contribution is on the second question, and he was strict about not letting it be read as a contribution to the first. Most of the noise around this subject comes from collapsing the two. Someone establishes something about the second question which is tractable, and then presents it as progress on the first, which is not. The finding that dying people reliably produce images of continuation is a fact about dying people. It becomes a claim about continuation only if you add a premise nobody can support. He refused to add the premise. That refusal is the most disciplined thing about him, and it is the first thing dropped by almost everyone who quotes him. Chapter 27. The instruction he gave anyway. But he did not stop at the shrug, and this is the practically useful part. He argued that a person ought to form some conception of what death is, and to do the work of forming it, even if the attempt fails. His phrasing is worth having close to hand. He said that a man should be able to say he has done his best to form a conception of life after death, or to create some image of it, even if he must confess his failure. And then the clause that does the work, not to have done so, is a vital loss. Notice that this is not a recommendation to believe anything, it is a recommendation to do a piece of work. His reasoning, which is clinical rather than theological, was that the psyche does not accept a blank. If you refuse the question entirely, the material does not go away. It goes underground and comes back as something else, as the dread at 1 a.m, as a restlessness that attaches itself to unrelated things, has the strange urgency older people sometimes feel about matters that do not warrant it. He thought the refusal to think about it at all was itself a symptom, and a costly one. There is an obvious objection to this instruction, and it deserves an answer. The objection is, why should I form a conception of something I cannot know anything about? That is not thinking, it is making things up. His answer, reconstructed from several places, runs roughly like this. You are going to have a conception whether you choose one or not. That is not optional. The mind does not hold a genuine blank on a question this size. It fills it, and if you do not participate in the filling, it will be filled by whatever is lying around. Half-remembered childhood religion, a film, a thing someone said at a funeral, the tone of a hospital corridor. The choice is not between having a conception and not having one. It is between one you have examined and one you absorbed. That reframing takes the exercise out of the realm of wishful thinking. He is not asking you to decide something is true. He is asking you to find out what you actually think on the grounds that you already think something, and that unexamined material is the kind that shows up at 1 a.m. with more authority than it has earned. Chapter 28. The interview. There is a small moment from near the end of his life that catches his epistemic style better than any of his books. In 1959, he was interviewed for British television by John Freeman in a program called Face to Face. It was a serious interview, in the mode of the time, filmed in the garden and study at his house on the lake. Late in it, Freeman asked him whether he believed in God. Jung paused, and then said that it was a difficult question to answer, and then said, "I know. I do not need to believe, I know." The line caused a great deal of trouble, and he spent time afterwards clarifying what he meant, which was not what most listeners took it to mean. He was not claiming a proof. He was making a distinction between belief, which is holding a proposition you cannot verify, and knowledge in the sense of an encounter you cannot doubt while also being unable to demonstrate it to anyone else. Whether that distinction is legitimate is a genuinely open philosophical question, and people have argued about it ever since. But it is exactly the distinction he is operating with when he talks about 1944. He is not saying he has evidence. He is saying he has an experience he cannot get behind, and that he will not pretend to doubt it in order to sound respectable, and that he equally will not ask you to accept it. There is a detail about that interview worth knowing, because it shows how carefully he policed the distinction. Afterwards, letters arrived, a great many of them, from people who had taken the line as a declaration of faith and wanted to know more, and from others who took it as arrogance. He answered them, and the answers are more precise than the broadcast was. He explained that he had not meant that he possessed a proof, and not that he had a private revelation unavailable to others. He meant that he had had experiences of something that behaved in his life with the force of an encounter, and that to call that belief would be to overstate the doubt, and to call it knowledge in the scientific sense would be to overstate the evidence. He was, in short, trying to name a third category, and English does not have a good word for it. You may think there is no such category, and that he was fooling himself. That is a respectable position. But he was not being lazy about it, and he spent the last years of his life trying to say it accurately rather than impressively, which is the opposite of what a man building a legend would do. Chapter 29. Why that position is unsatisfying to everyone. It is worth naming who this annoys, because it annoys almost everybody, and that is usually a sign of something. It annoys people who want the story to be a proof. They quote the glorious sentence and drop the paragraphs where he says he cannot know. There are a great many videos on the internet doing precisely this, with titles suggesting that a banned letter or a hidden document reveals what Jung really knew. There is no banned letter. The material has been in print since 1962, and you can buy it in any bookshop. And it annoys people who want the story to be nothing. Because he was not credulous, he was not untrained. He was a physician who had spent 40 years distinguishing between kinds of inner states, and his account is too detailed and too internally consistent to wave away as confusion. He sits in the middle, refusing both. And the middle is an uncomfortable place to stand at 1 a.m. when you would quite like an answer. I am going to leave you standing there, but not empty-handed, because in the 80 years since, a considerable amount of actual research has been done on exactly this, and it is more interesting than either camp usually reports. It is worth adding one more group to the list of people this annoys, because it includes most of us at some point. It annoys anyone who is frightened and wants it to stop. That is not a criticism. It is the most understandable want in the world. When the thought arrives at 1 a.m, a carefully balanced epistemological position is not what you are reaching for. You want either reassurance or dismissal, because both of those end the episode and the middle does not. So it is worth saying explicitly, sitting in the middle is a daylight activity. At 1 a.m, you are not obliged to hold a nuanced position. You are allowed to simply stop thinking about it on the grounds that nothing can be resolved at this hour and you are tired. That is not intellectual cowardice. It is the correct allocation of a difficult task to a time when you have the resources for it. Do the honest thinking in daylight, in small amounts, when the question is manageable. At night, put it down. That is not the same as refusing it. Chapter 30. One more thing about the nights. Before we turn to the research, return to that detail from the end of chapter 20, because it is a small anomaly, and small anomalies are usually where the useful information is. The visions did not happen once during the crisis. They came back at night for several weeks afterwards while he was recovering. Then they stopped and never returned for the remaining 17 years of his life. That pattern is worth holding. A single event during a physiological crisis is one kind of thing. A recurring nightly state during convalescence, which then ends and does not come back, is a different kind of thing, and it fits somewhat awkwardly with the purely physiological explanations we're about to look at, because during those later weeks, he was not dying. His heart had stabilized. He was sitting up. It also fits somewhat awkwardly with a purely metaphysical reading, because whatever door was open was apparently open for a few weeks and then closed, which is not how the afterlife is usually described. I do not have a resolution for you. I am flagging it because it is the sort of detail that gets left out by both sides, and because it is exactly the sort of detail a careful listener should want to know about. There is one further thing about that pattern that occurs to me, and I offer it as a speculation clearly labelled as one. The nightly visions stopped after a few weeks. He was, by then, physically recovering and psychologically flattened, and then the states arrived, and then they ended. Compare that to the period after 1913, which he described in similar terms, and which also had a beginning and an end. Both times, the material arrived during a period of profound disruption. Both times it lasted a matter of weeks or years, rather than continuing indefinitely. Both times, the productive work came afterwards rather than during. If there is a pattern there, it is not one about death at all. It is one about what a particular kind of mind does when its ordinary structures are broken open, and about the fact that such states appear to be self-limiting, and that their value is realized in the ordinary years that follow, rather than in the state itself. That is a considerably less exciting proposition than the afterlife. It also has the advantage of matching everything we can actually observe about him. Chapter 31. The Turn. So that is his account, as completely and as honestly as I can give it. A broken leg, 10 days of stillness, a clot, the earth from a great height, blue and silver, a dark stone temple with a wreath of small flames around the door, a man sitting in perfect readiness, a certainty that the meaning of a whole life was about to be handed over. And then a doctor rising out of Europe wearing the authority of an ancient healing king, and a message that there was a protest and that he had to go back. Then disappointment, 3 weeks of depression, several weeks of nightly ecstasy, and 10 years of the best work he ever did. The question we turn to now is not whether to believe him. It is a better question than that. The question is, what has been found out by people with instruments about what happens in a mind at that edge? Because a great deal has, and almost none of it is what either the believers or the debunkers will tell you. Before the research, one last piece of tidying, because 2 things in that summary are doing different jobs and should not be confused. There is the crisis itself, in early March, when his heart was failing. That is the part that lines up with what the modern literature studies, and it is the part the physiological explanations address. And there is the second phase, the nightly states over the following weeks, when he was recovering and stable. Almost every retelling merges these into one event. They should not be merged. They happened under entirely different physiological conditions, weeks apart, and only the first one qualifies as anything the research would recognize as a near-death experience. The second phase is closer to something else, the kind of sustained visionary state that appears in the literature on mystical experience and in accounts of certain fevers, and in Jung's own earlier life, in the period after 1913, when he had spent years deliberately cultivating exactly this sort of material. That is worth knowing. He was uniquely among the people whose accounts we have, a man who had spent decades training himself to enter and record visionary states. Whatever happened in that hospital happened to a specialist. Chapter 32. The word did not exist yet. When Jung had his experience in 1944, there was no name for it. There was no category, no literature, no scale, no research program. A person who had been through something like that had two options: religious language or silence. Most chose silence, for the obvious reason that the alternative was to be thought unwell. The name arrived in 1975 in a book by an American doctor called Raymond Moody. He had collected about 50 accounts from people who had been resuscitated or had come close to death, and he noticed that they resembled one another far more than they should have. He assembled the common elements into a composite, and he gave the whole thing a name: the near-death experience. We should be clear about what that book was and was not. It was not research. There was no control group, no systematic sampling, no attempt to check the accounts against records. It was a collection of stories with a pattern drawn through them by a sympathetic listener. But it did the thing that first books sometimes do. It made the subject speakable, and once it was speakable, people who could do proper work on it began to. It is worth noting how recent all of this is. The word is 50 years old. The first systematic study is 45. The scale is 40. The first properly designed prospective study is from this century. For essentially all of human history, and for the whole of Jung's life, there was no organized knowledge about this at all. There were religious traditions, which had a great deal to say and no way to check any of it, and there was medicine, which mostly did not ask. That gap is why so much nonsense accumulated in the space. When a subject is universally interesting and has no established method, the vacuum gets filled by whoever speaks with the most confidence. The genuinely good news is that the vacuum is smaller than it was. There is now real work done by cardiologists and psychiatrists and neurologists, published in ordinary journals with the ordinary machinery of criticism attached. It is not a large field, and it is underfunded, and some of its practitioners hold views well ahead of their evidence. But it exists, and that means that for the first time it is possible to say something about this subject that is neither faith nor dismissal. Chapter 33. The first attempt to count. The first systematic study came 5 years later from a psychologist named Kenneth Ring. He did what Moody had not. He found survivors through hospitals rather than through people who had written in, interviewed them in a standard way, and counted. Roughly half of the people in his sample reported nothing at all. That is worth saying first, because it is the fact that most enthusiastic accounts skip. The majority of people who come close to death and are brought back report exactly what you would expect, which is a gap, nothing. They were there, and then they were in a bed, and there was no middle. Among those who did report something, he found the elements grouped in a rough order, moving from a feeling of peace through a sense of separation from the body into darkness, then light, then, in a small number of cases, something that felt like an environment or a boundary. The further along that sequence you go, the fewer people report it. The peace is common. The temple with the lamps around the door is not. There is a finding buried in that early work which is worth pulling out because it complicates both sides. Not everyone who reports one of these experiences was actually dying. Cases turn up of people who believe themselves to be in mortal danger in a fall or a crash or a moment of panic, who were never in any real physiological difficulty and who nonetheless report the full sequence: the peace, the separation, the review, the light. That is awkward for the dying brain account, because in those cases the brain was fine. Nothing was starved of anything. And it is awkward for the other account too, because if the experience arrives simply because a person believed they were dying, then it looks a great deal like a psychological response to the expectation of death, rather than a perception of anything beyond it. The best current guess is that the trigger is not the physiological state, but the perception of imminent death, which would make it a defensive response of some kind, deployed at the moment the system concludes it is ending, whether or not that conclusion is correct. That is a real hypothesis with real support, and it fits Jung, who may or may not have been as close as everyone believed. Chapter 34. The Scale. The field's most useful instrument came in 1983 from a psychiatrist named Bruce Grayson. He built a 16-item scale. It asks about specific components: whether time seemed altered, whether thinking became unusually clear or fast, whether a life review occurred, whether there was a sense of peace, of separation from the body, of an unearthly environment, of encountering a presence or a border. Score above a threshold, and the experience is classified as a near-death experience for research purposes. Score below, and it is not. That sounds bureaucratic, and it is the most valuable thing anyone did in this field. Before the scale, every researcher meant something slightly different by the term, and no two studies could be compared. After it, they could. The scale has held up well psychometrically over 4 decades, which is more than can be said for a great many instruments in psychology, and it is the reason we can now say things about how often this happens rather than only that it happens. The number that comes out of the good studies is somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% of people who survive a cardiac arrest. It is not rare, it is also not typical. There is one property of that scale worth understanding, because it explains a lot of the confusion in public discussion. The experience is not one thing. The scale measures 16 separate items, and they do not travel together. A person can report profound peace and nothing else. Another can report leaving the body and nothing else. Another can have the full sequence, including an encounter and a border. When people argue about whether near-death experiences are real, they are usually arguing past each other because they are picturing different items on the list. The person defending them is picturing the temple. The person dismissing them is picturing the tunnel, and the explanations differ by item. The out-of-body component has a strong and specific neurological account. The peace has a plausible account. The life review has a weaker one. The sense of an encounter with a presence has almost none. So, the honest statement is not that these experiences are explained or unexplained, It is that some components are well accounted for, some are partly accounted for, and some are not accounted for at all, and the proportions are different for every case. Chapter 35. The study that changed the argument. In 2001, a Dutch cardiologist named Pim van Lommel published a study in The Lancet that is still the reference point. What made it different was that it was prospective. Previous work had found people who reported an experience and then studied them, which cannot tell you what distinguishes them from anyone else. Van Lommel and his colleagues instead took every consecutive patient successfully resuscitated from cardiac arrest across 10 Dutch hospitals, 344 of them, and interviewed all of them within a few days, whether they reported anything or not. 18% recalled something. 12% had what the scale would count as a core experience. And then they did the thing that made it matter. They compared the group who reported an experience against the group who did not, on every variable they had. If the experience is produced by oxygen starvation, then the people who were down longer should report it more. They did not. If it is produced by the drugs administered during resuscitation, the medication should differ between groups. It did not. If it is produced by fear, then people who were more frightened beforehand should report it more. They did not. There is one more result from that program worth mentioning, because it is small and strange and honest. Among the patients who reported nothing, some were troubled by that. They had been through the same catastrophe. They had heard afterwards that others come back with something, and they had come back with a gap, and some of them experienced that as a kind of exclusion, as though a door had been open and they had not been shown through it. I mention it because if you have had a serious illness or a real emergency and returned with nothing at all, that is by a considerable margin the most common outcome, and it means nothing about you. Most people report nothing. The absence is the ordinary case, not the failure. It is worth saying because this material, presented badly, can leave people feeling that a profound experience was available and they somehow missed it. Nothing in the research supports that reading. Whatever determines who has one of these, it is not merit and it is not attention. Chapter 36. What that finding does and does not prove. Be careful here, because this study gets overclaimed constantly, including by its own author in his later popular writing. What it establishes is genuinely important. The simplest physiological explanations, in their crude forms, do not account for who has these experiences and who does not. If it were straightforwardly a matter of how long the brain went without oxygen, we would see that in the numbers, and we do not. What it does not establish is that the experience happens outside the brain. A null result on 3 candidate mechanisms is not a positive result for a 4th. There are many things it could be that were not measured, including individual differences in how brains fail, differences in the depth or pattern of cerebral shutdown that the crude measure of arrest duration does not capture, and differences in what people are able to remember and report afterwards. The study narrowed the field of explanations. It did not empty it. There is one further finding from the same program that is less contested and, I think, more interesting. They followed people up at 2 years and at 8, and the changes in those who had the experience were durable and large, in a way that ordinary brushes with death did not produce. We will come back to that because it is the sturdiest thing in this entire literature. There is a methodological point in that study worth carrying because it applies far beyond this subject. The reason the prospective design mattered so much is that it removed the person who reports from the process of selection. In the earlier work, researchers found their subjects among people who had come forward. People who come forward are not a random sample. They are the ones for whom the experience mattered enough to speak about it, which means they are already the interesting cases. Anything you measure in that group tells you about the group and not about the population. By taking every consecutive survivor, whether they said anything or not, Van Lommel got a denominator. That is the whole of it, a denominator. It is why we can now say 10 to 20% rather than a great many people. And the difference between those two phrasings is the difference between knowledge and impression. If you take one transferable habit from tonight, it might be to ask of any striking claim about how often something happens, who was counted, and who selected them. Chapter 37. The test that was designed to settle it. If people leave their bodies and look down, that ought to be testable, and eventually somebody tested it properly. A physician named Sam Parnia ran a study across 15 hospitals, published in 2014, with a design of real elegance. Shelves were installed high up in the rooms where resuscitations happen, each bearing an image visible only from above. If anyone genuinely floated near the ceiling and looked around, the image would be there to be reported. The result was a null. Over 2,000 cardiac arrests, a few hundred survivors, around 140 interviewed. Roughly 9% met criteria for an experience. Not one of them reported an image from a shelf. There was one striking case, frequently quoted, of a man who described events during his own resuscitation with a level of accuracy that appeared to correspond to the actual timeline, including auditory details. It is genuinely interesting, and it has never been fully explained. It also occurred in a room without a shelf, so it does not count as a hit on the test, and a single unreplicated case is a lead rather than a finding. A second phase of the work, reported in 2023, added brain monitoring during resuscitation and found something unexpected, which we will come to in a moment. A word about how that null result should be read, because it is routinely misused by both sides. The believers tend to explain it away, usually by suggesting that a person having the most significant experience of their existence is unlikely to spend it reading pictures on a shelf. That is not an unreasonable point, and it is also unfalsifiable. And unfalsifiable rescues should make you uncomfortable, regardless of which side offers them. The skeptics tend to treat it as decisive. It is not quite that either. The number of usable cases was very small. Of thousands of arrests, only a handful of people both survived, were interviewable, reported an experience, and were in a room with a target. The study was underpowered for the question it was designed to answer, through no fault of the design. The fair summary is that the most direct test anyone has managed produced no positive evidence that this is meaningful and that it is not the end of the matter because the test barely got to run. That is an unsatisfying paragraph. It is also, as far as I can tell, the accurate one. Chapter 38. The oxygen argument. Now, the deflationary explanations, given properly, because a fair hearing means the strongest version of each. The most obvious is that a brain deprived of oxygen malfunctions in characteristic ways. Pilots in high-gravity training centrifuges, when blood drains from the head, reliably report tunnel vision, a bright central field, floating sensations, brief vivid dreamlets, and sometimes euphoria. That is a large body of evidence from people who were definitely not dying. And it reproduces several features of the reports. There is also good evidence for carbon dioxide. A study of cardiac arrest survivors found that those who reported experiences had measurably higher levels of carbon dioxide in their blood at the time. That is a direct physiological correlate obtained in real patients, and it is one of the more solid findings in the area. Neither of these accounts for everything. Tunnel vision and euphoria are not a temple with oil lamps, and a great many people with identical blood gases report nothing. But anyone who tells you there is no physiological signal is not reading the same literature. There is a fair objection to the oxygen account that should be given its due, because it is not a small one. Pilots in centrifuges do not report life reviews. They do not report meeting deceased relatives. They do not report a border or a decision or a sense that they were somewhere with its own rules. What they report is fragmentary and brief, and, crucially, they generally know afterwards that it was a physiological event. It does not have the quality of realness that is the defining feature of the accounts we are discussing, and it does not reorganize their lives. So the centrifuge data explains the tunnel and the light and some of the euphoria, which is genuinely useful, and it does not explain the structure. This is the pattern you keep meeting in this literature, and by now you can probably predict it. Every proposed mechanism accounts for a component. None of them accounts for the whole, and the components that remain unaccounted for are, inconveniently, the ones that matter most to the people who have them. That is not a gap that proves anything. It is just the actual state of the question. Chapter 39. The spot in the brain. In 2002, a Swiss neurologist named Olaf Blanke published a short paper in Nature that is one of the most quietly consequential results in the field. He was mapping the brain of a patient with epilepsy using implanted electrodes, a standard procedure before surgery, in which regions are stimulated to find out what they do. When he stimulated a particular area on the right side, where the temporal and parietal lobes meet, the patient reported leaving her body. She saw herself from above, lying on the bed. Stimulate again, and it happened again. Vary the current, and the effect varied. That region turns out to be where the brain integrates signals about where your body is, what it is touching, what your inner ear says about balance, and what your eyes report. When those streams disagree badly enough, the brain constructs a location for you, and it can put you in the wrong place. This is the strongest single piece of evidence that the out-of-body component is a brain event. It can be produced on demand in a conscious patient with a wire. I think anyone honest has to concede that a good deal of the floating is accounted for here. It is worth being precise about what that result does and does not cover, because it is often stretched. What was induced was the out-of-body component, a sense of being located outside the physical body, seeing it from another position. That is a large part of what people report, and it is the part that sounds most like evidence of a soul, so accounting for it neurologically matters a great deal. It is not the whole of what people report. Stimulating that region does not produce a life review. It does not produce an encounter with a figure. It does not produce the sense of profound meaning that is, in the survey data, the single most consistently reported feature. Patients in those experiments describe something strange happening to their sense of position. They do not describe the most important event of their lives. So the finding is genuinely important and genuinely partial. It shows that the architecture of self-location can be disrupted in a way that produces one signature feature of these accounts. It does not show that a temple with lamps around the door is a misfiring parietal lobe. Chapter 40. Dreaming, Anaesthetics, and the Last Surge. 3 more, briefly. A neurologist named Kevin Nelson noticed that people who report near-death experiences also report at higher rates than average a phenomenon called REM intrusion, in which the machinery of dreaming switches on while a person is awake. Sleep paralysis is the common form of it. His suggestion is that some people have a nervous system more prone to blending dreaming and waking states, and that a crisis triggers that blend. Second, the anaesthetic ketamine, at certain doses, reliably produces experiences that overlap substantially with these reports: separation from the body, passage through a dark space, encounters, and a profound sense of significance. It acts on a specific receptor system that is also disrupted when the brain is starved of oxygen, which supplies a plausible common pathway. Third, and most recent, it was assumed for a long time that a brain deprived of blood simply goes quiet, and that a quiet brain cannot generate an elaborate experience. That assumption now looks wrong. Work on animals, and then on a small number of dying human patients, has found a surge of high-frequency organized activity in the moments after the heart stops, of the kind normally associated with intense conscious processing and located in the regions associated with conscious awareness. The human sample is tiny, 2 patients in the most cited report, and it must not be overread. But it removes the argument that there is nothing there to do the experiencing with. 2 cautions about that last piece of work, since it is the newest and therefore the most likely to be overstated. The human sample was 2 patients, 2, in a study of 4, of whom 2 showed the effect. It is very good that anyone managed to record it at all, given the extraordinary difficulty of obtaining such recordings, and it points somewhere important. It is also, by any ordinary standard, preliminary. Nothing about the inner life of a dying person can be concluded from 2 anonymized traces of electrical activity in patients who did not survive to describe anything. And the second caution is the more basic one. Activity in a region associated with conscious processing is not consciousness. It is a correlate. The inference from one to the other is exactly the inference the whole field is trying to make and has not yet made. I am laboring this because the finding has been reported in the press as evidence that dying people have vivid experiences, which is not what was shown. What was shown is that the brain does something organized at a moment we assumed it did nothing. That is quite interesting enough without the extra step. Chapter 41. What all that adds up to. Put the deflationary case at its strongest, and it goes like this. A brain in crisis has a known repertoire. It produces tunnel vision and light from failing perfusion. It produces out-of-body relocation when the integration region misfires. It produces dreamlike content through mechanisms shared with REM and with dissociative anaesthetics. It is, we now know, capable of a burst of highly organized activity precisely when we assumed it had stopped. And it assembles all of this out of the individual's own memory and culture. Which is why a Swiss psychiatrist steeped in classical learning met a Greek healing king, and why the temple he found was one he had seen on the coast of India. That is a strong case, and I am not going to pretend it is weak. Here is what it does not do. It does not explain the specific finding that the depth of the physiological insult does not predict who has the experience. It does not explain why the experiences are so consistently ordered and coherent when brains under other insults produce disordered and fragmentary states. It does not explain the small number of accurate reports of events during arrest. And it does not touch the question of whether an experience produced by a brain is thereby an experience of nothing, which is a philosophical question that no amount of imaging will settle, and which applies equally to the experience you are having right now. There is a philosophical point in that last sentence that is worth unfolding because it is the hinge of the whole disagreement, and it is almost never made explicit. The argument runs, this experience was produced by a brain, therefore it was not a perception of anything real. Notice that the same argument, applied to any other experience, gives a conclusion nobody accepts. Your experience of this room is produced by a brain. Your experience of a piece of music is produced by a brain. Your experience of another person's face and of loving them is produced by a brain. In none of those cases do we conclude that there is nothing there. The reason we do not is that we have independent access. Other people see the room. The music can be recorded. So the honest form of the skeptical argument is not that brain-produced means unreal. It is that we have no independent access in this case, and therefore no way to check. That is a much weaker claim, and a much more defensible one, and it leaves the question open rather than closing it, which is, as it happens, exactly where Jung left it. Chapter 42. The finding nobody disputes. Set the metaphysics aside entirely, because there is one result in this field that every camp accepts, and it is the one that actually bears on your life. People who have these experiences change, and the change lasts. They report, at follow-up years later, a substantially reduced fear of death, not an intellectual reduction, a settled one. They report reduced interest in status and possessions, increased interest in other people, and an increased sense that their life has a shape. The pattern holds across studies, across countries, and across the long follow-ups. And critically, it does not hold for the control groups. People who had an equally severe cardiac arrest and reported no experience do not show the change. Coming close to death is not what does it. Having the experience is what does it. That is a real, measured, replicated effect, and it is entirely independent of what the experience is. Which gives us the honest bottom line for the evening. We do not know what these experiences are. We do know, with decent confidence, that having one reliably removes a person's fear of dying for the rest of their life. There is a caveat to attach to that finding, in fairness, and then a reason it survives the caveat. The caveat is that people who have an intense, meaningful experience of any kind often change afterwards, and the studies cannot fully separate the effect of the experience from the effect of believing something significant happened. Expectation shapes outcome, and a person who is certain they have glimpsed something will behave differently for that reason alone. That is a real confound, and it has not been eliminated. Here is why the finding still holds up. The comparison group is not people who had a boring life. It is people who had the identical medical catastrophe, the same arrest, the same resuscitation, the same brush with an ending, and reported no experience. Both groups have every reason to be changed by nearly dying. Only one group is whatever is doing the work. It is not the proximity to death. It is the content of what happened in those minutes, and that content leaves a mark that is still measurable 8 years later. Chapter 43. Back to the hospital bed. Now look at Jung again with all of that in hand. The deflationary account handles a good deal of him. The floating is the integration region. The blue earth is an atlas and a mind. The Greek healing king is 40 years of classical reading assembled under pressure. The vividness is what a brain does in that state, and the after-effect finding describes him almost exactly. A man who came back with his fear of the subject visibly gone, who abandoned a lifetime of professional caution, who stopped managing his reputation, and who did his boldest work in the years he had left. He would not have objected to any of this. That is the thing to notice. He never claimed the vision came from outside him. He was a psychologist. His entire life's work was the proposition that the psyche produces images of enormous power out of its own depths, and that those images matter because of what they do, not because of where they came from. He would have said, I think, that asking whether the temple was really there is the wrong question, in roughly the way that asking whether a piece of music is really sad is the wrong question. What he would have insisted on is the part the debunkers get wrong. Not that it was supernatural, that it was not nothing. There is a last observation to make about him specifically, and it is a slightly uncomfortable one. Of all the people to whom this could have happened, it happened to the one best equipped to make something of it. He had a theoretical framework already built that could accommodate it. He had 4 decades of practice at recording and interpreting inner imagery. He had the cultural material, the classical education, the Indian travels, the years of work on religious symbolism, all of it sitting ready to supply the furniture. A different man in that bed would have had a bright light and a feeling of peace and no vocabulary for any of it. You can read that 2 ways, and both are worth holding. The deflationary reading is that this is exactly what you would expect if the mind builds these experiences from available materials. The richest account comes from the best-stocked mind. The other reading is that a lifetime of preparation is precisely what allowed something genuinely encountered to be received in detail rather than as an undifferentiated blur. There is no way to choose between those from here. But notice that the deflationary reading, which is probably the correct one, does not actually reduce the event. It relocates the astonishment. The mind did this, under those conditions, in minutes. Chapter 44. What you have and what you do not. Let us be plain about where the evening leaves you, because you were promised honesty rather than comfort, and it turns out there is some comfort in the honesty. You do not have proof of anything. Nobody does. The question of whether something continues is exactly as open as it was before you pressed play. And it will remain open for the rest of your life, and probably for the rest of everybody's. What you have instead is a set of facts, and they are worth listing in one place. A significant minority of people who come as close to death as it is possible to come and return, somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5, report an experience. Those experiences are consistent in structure across cultures and centuries, though the furniture inside them is local. The severity of the physiological crisis does not predict who has one. A good deal of the content has plausible mechanisms in the brain, and some of it can be produced deliberately with electrodes and with drugs. The brain is not silent at the moment we assumed it was silent. And the people who have them stop being afraid of dying permanently in a way that people who merely nearly died do not. That is the whole of what is actually known, and it is more than nothing. It is worth adding one more item to that list, because it is the one that most often gets left off, and it cuts against the comforting version. A minority of these experiences are distressing. The figure is uncertain, and the research is thinner than it should be, partly because people who have a frightening one are considerably less likely to report it. Estimates vary widely. What is clear is that the phenomenon exists, that it includes experiences of void, of isolation, and in some cases of active terror, and that people who have them often carry them alone for years because every account they encounter is serene. I am including it for the same reason I included the disappointment and the 3 weeks of depression. A version of this subject that only contains the beautiful parts is not honest, and dishonesty in this territory does real harm to people who need the truth more than they need reassurance. If that has been your experience, or someone's you know, it is documented, it has a literature, and it is not a verdict on you. Chapter 45. Why the Hour Matters. Now the practical question, which is why any of this feels different at 1 in the morning than it does at 11 in the morning. The thought is identical. The facts are identical. What has changed is you. During the day, your attention is committed. There are tasks, other people, decisions, noise. The machinery that keeps the large questions at a manageable distance is running at full power, and it is powered by everything you have to do. At 1 a.m, there is nothing to do. The machinery has nothing to run on. And into the space it leaves comes the largest unresolved item you have, because that is what fills a vacuum. Not the small worries which need daylight and detail, but the one enormous open question that never gets worked on. This is why it feels like a revelation. It arrives with the force of something suddenly seen clearly. It is not a revelation. It is the same question it was at noon. It simply has the room to itself. Knowing that does not make it leave, but it changes what kind of thing you think is happening. You are not, at 1 a.m, finally seeing the truth about your situation. You are experiencing the ordinary consequence of an undefended mind in a quiet room. And the ordinary consequence will pass. And it will pass sooner if you do not treat its arrival as evidence of anything. There is a practical consequence of that, and it is the most useful thing in the last part of this evening. If the thought is produced by an undefended mind in an empty room, then the response is not to argue with the thought, it is to change the conditions. That does not mean distraction, exactly. Distraction is what the phone does, and the phone will keep you awake for another hour while pretending to help. It means giving the front of the mind something low and slow to hold. A voice. A familiar route walked in imagination. The deliberate, slow accounting of an ordinary day from beginning to end. Anything that occupies a little of the machinery without demanding anything. This is, incidentally, the mechanism by which a recording like this one works at all, and there is no reason to be coy about it. It is not that the ideas are sedative. It is that a quiet voice, moving slowly through something orderly, gives an undefended mind a shape to rest against, and shapes are what it was missing. You do not have to resolve the question to get to sleep. You have to stop being alone in an empty room with it. Chapter 46. The work he actually recommended. Jung's instruction, when you strip the mysticism off it, was not to believe anything. It was to do a piece of work that most people never do. Form a conception. Whatever conception you can honestly hold. Do the thinking, arrive somewhere, and accept that where you arrive may be a confession of failure. His clinical claim was that the psyche does not tolerate a blank on this question, and that if you decline to work on it, the material does not disappear. It relocates. It becomes the dread at this hour. It becomes an urgency about things that do not warrant urgency. It becomes the peculiar irritability that some people acquire in their 60s and cannot explain. Not to have done the work, he said, is a vital loss. Notice the modesty of it. He is not asking you to reach a conclusion. He spent 17 years after the most extraordinary experience of his life declining to reach one himself. He is asking you to stop leaving the question entirely unattended, because unattended is the one condition under which it gets loud. There is a version of that work that is small enough to actually do, and it is worth naming, so it does not stay abstract. It is not a philosophy, it is 3 or 4 sentences. What do I actually think happens? What do I think is most likely on the evidence I have, being honest that the evidence is thin? What would I want to be true, kept clearly separate from the first two? And what, given all of that, do I want to do with the part I can still affect? That is the whole exercise. It takes 20 minutes in daylight once, and it can be revised whenever you like. Most people have never done it. They have absorbed a position and never examined it, or they have avoided the subject so completely that there is nothing there but a raw edge. Doing it does not settle the question. He was clear that nothing settles the question. What it does is convert an ambush into a topic, and a topic can be set down at night in a way that an ambush cannot. Chapter 47. The smaller, harder thing. And there is one more piece, which is his and which is easy to miss because it arrives in the middle of the vision rather than at the end of it. Before the door, everything was stripped away, and what remained was the life he had actually lived. Not the life he intended, not the explanation of it, the thing itself. I consist of my own history, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am. Whatever produced that image, it is a serious proposition, and it can be taken seriously by someone who believes nothing at all about what follows. It says the unit is the life, not the accomplishments inside it, which the stripping removed, not the reputation which went with them, not the plans which were the first thing to go. The actual accumulated substance of the days, including the ordinary ones, including tonight, that is not a comforting thought if you are hoping for a verdict in your favor. There is no verdict in it. But it is a steadying one, because it locates the whole of what matters inside something you already have and are not at risk of losing before the end. He was given by his own account one further instruction. There was a protest. He had no right to leave the earth. He had to go back. And what he did with the years he was sent back for is the most checkable part of this entire story. He stopped being careful. He wrote the books he had been afraid to write. There is one more thing worth taking from that image, and then we can let the evening close. Notice that the stripping was described as painful, and the result was not. He lost everything he had aimed at and wished for, and he called that extremely painful, and then he said what remained was a certainty, not a loss. A certainty. This is what I am. Whatever the source of that, it names something people discover in less dramatic circumstances all the time. That a great deal of what we carry as essential is actually cargo, and that the discovery of how little is load-bearing is frightening on the way and steadying afterwards. Illness does this to people. So does losing work that had become an identity. So, sometimes, does simply getting older and watching the plans thin out. The common report from the other side of it is not despair. It is a strange, narrow relief. There was less required than you thought. That is available without a cardiac arrest, and it is available at this hour, tonight, for the length of one breath. The plain fact that the life is already substantially made, that most of it happened while you were not supervising, and that it does not need defending in the dark. Chapter 48. The last chapter. It is late now, and this can be short. A man slipped on ice in February and nearly died in March. And while he was dying, he saw the earth from very high up, blue and silver, with the desert going gold away to the left. He saw a dark stone the size of a house, and a doorway in it, and around the doorway hundreds of small oil lamps burning steadily. He saw someone waiting for him without any impatience at all. He did not get to go in. He was disappointed for 3 weeks, and then he got up and worked for 17 years, and, at the very end of his life, he described the whole thing once, carefully, and refused to say what it meant. I cannot tell you what it was, neither could he, and he was there. But consider as you go down that both of the available answers are remarkable. If it was a report, then something is on the other side of that door, and he very nearly saw it. And if it was a brain, then a failing organ, minutes from stopping, its blood gone, assembled out of a lifetime of memory, a place of complete quiet, put a wreath of small, steady flames around the entrance, and set there a figure who was expecting him without expectation. And it did that not to frighten him, but to receive him. Whatever is or is not waiting, that is what a mind does at the edge. It builds somewhere calm, and it lights the door. That is worth knowing, tonight, at this hour, in this room, with nothing required of you. You do not have to settle any of it now. The question will keep. It has kept for everyone who has ever had it, and it will still be there in the morning, considerably smaller in daylight, as it always is. For now, there is only the dark and the ordinary safe fact of the bed, and a body that is going to keep breathing without being asked. Let the hour pass. Let the question set itself down for a few hours. It has waited this long, and it can wait until it is light. Sleep now. You have been listening to Philopsych Sleep. If this was useful, it is here every night, and it will keep being here. Rest well.